Hello, everyone. Today we'll start talking about chapter 3 on cosmic origins, and we'll begin with Peterson. The way the book is structured, and this is a very nice feature of the structure, each chapter flips, they alternate who begins and who ends the chapter. And that's because there's this kind of psychological phenomena in which if you hear the last speaker in a debate and they have the last word on the subject matter, we kind of unconsciously associate the last word with the kind of triumphant version of the story, or the last word as the conclusion, the thing to be, the thing that stands. So we tend to associate the last participant in the dialogue that speaks with the one who wins, in a way to kind of prevent or obviate that kind of psychological trickery that we play on ourselves, is by alternating who goes first. And I just follow the pattern. So in this case, in this particular case, chapter 3, Peterson goes first. And then the content is mainly a Big Bang cosmology, though there are a couple of other questions that are not quite addressed by Big Bang cosmology. But the main question is something like, given Big Bang cosmology, given the very credible theories that we have and the very strong empirical support for those theories about there being an origin of the universe, Big Bang cosmology, given that scientific theory, how should we think about, say, whether God exists or not? How does that theory fit with or fail to fit with theistic or atheistic beliefs? And that's kind of the main question for our class. I mean, for this chapter. Again, one of the reasons what I really like about this book is that both Peterson and Roos take on science. They are scientists. They agree with science. They accept it. And then they try to see how it fits with their more broad worldviews, atheistic or theistic, respectively. So neither of them is sympathetic towards, or at least does not agree with, some popular discussions that happen in our society between theists that reject science by appealing to biblical revelation, or atheists that reject religion simply by pointing to scientific discoveries. Both Peterson and Roos agree that both of those moves are too quick, they're too facile. They have people that make those moves have not really looked at the evidence carefully enough, they think, Peterson and Roos thinks. So they have a lot more kind of common ground so they can talk to each other. That's always a good thing. So let us begin. So Peterson, he titled his version of the chapter, A Theistic Understanding of the Universe. So he begins with the observation he's made a couple of times, and this is kind of the recurring argument that he's going to put forth, namely that theism makes better sense, makes better philosophical sense of the scientific discoveries in other pieces of data or phenomena like the existence of mind and morality. Theism makes better sense of those things than atheism does. So here's how he puts it. My argument here is that theism makes the better philosophical sense of what we know scientifically about the origin and structure of the universe than naturalism does. And Peterson is pushing, and it's crucial to see this, is not the science entails or proves God. Of course it does, and by definition. But Peterson says the person, the philosopher who sees objectively the discoveries of science, can now think about what those discoveries imply, or what kind of bearing do they have for the question about whether or not God exists. And that's the terrain of philosophy. And that's the terrain that is, being fought between Roos and Peterson. So here's a brief, very brief description of Big Bang cosmology. So quote, the Big Bang occurred about 13.75 billion years ago with a B, when all matter and energy was compressed into an infinitesimally small point called singularity, with 10 to the negative 43 power, so dot followed by 43 zeros, of a second. After this cataclysmic explosion, rapid expansion took place. A modest asymmetry of matter and antimatter allowed for matter to emerge. Photons, neutrinos, electrons, and quarks formed and became the first building blocks of physical reality. Cooling allowed protons and neutrinos to form, which were needed for the structure of hydrogen and helium atoms, and so on. Right, so this is just a very basic description of some of the fundamental mechanisms that give rise to different kind of atoms. Sorry. And it's crucial to note that this description begins with the tiny, tiny little distance or time, a 10 to to the negative 43th of a second, right? So that tiny little fraction sliver of time. The way that Big Bang cosmology is currently understood, we begin with a description of the physical world as we have it now. There's the observation that the universe is expanding, right? It's expanding. And scientists put that information to a computer model and then go backwards in time. So the fact that as time goes forward means that the universe is expanding. When you go backwards in the mathematical computer model, it means that the universe is contracting, going backward, contracting. In the sophisticated mathematical / computer models that we have to mirror or to mimic or to model the way in which physical universe operates, they work well up until this tiny little fraction of time, right? The 10 to the negative 43rd power of a second. At that point, the model breaks down. We do not understand physics well enough to know anything before that. It is that kind of tiny little fraction of time that from that point onward, that scientists have a fairly good handle on what has happened afterwards. But before that, we don't. Scientists do not. And that gives rise to questions. That gives rise to all sorts of questions. And here's a question. What happened before that or during that tiny interval, that extremely tiny interval of time? What happened before that, if that makes sense to talk about before that? And that's kind of where the discussion is leading. So because physics or cosmology begins with that tiny, after that tiny interval of time, Peterson calls metaphysical explanations the kinds of explanations that are asking the questions of what happened before and so on, with the explicit flagging that we're not really operating within Big Bang cosmology anymore. We're accepting Big Bang cosmology because it is a well-established scientific theory. And we are asking questions about the implications of that theory, but we're no longer operating within science. So the accusation, hey, you're not doing science, is a misunderstanding of what Peterson is doing. Of course, he's not doing science. He's been very explicit about the fact he's not doing science. He's doing metaphysics or philosophy, thinking about the implications of the science. So it is no accusation to say that he's not doing science. He's not trying to do science. He's doing something else. But Peterson points out that there's this famous scientist who does something similar to what he's doing in metaphysical explanation. It goes beyond Big Bang cosmology and tries to provide a purely naturalistic explanation for the origin of the world, the universe as we know it. And that's Hawkins, of course. And here's what Hawkins said. Here's a quote by Peterson about what Hawkins said. Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. A spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. And of course, Hawking has this very sophisticated mathematical model that appeals to things like quantum fluctuations, appeals to something he calls imaginary time to allow for the possibility of motion or change prior to time as we know it, space-time, as grounded in general theory of relativity. That thing came into being for the Big Bang, the singularity. So Hawkins postulates this other thing, imaginary time, to allow for fluctuations or changes at the quantum level prior to that singularity. And he has a very sophisticated model to kind of argue for this. But here's what Peterson says in response to what Hawkins is doing. Hawkins' awkward language about the universe creating itself is best viewed as a mechanical explanation for how things developed. So Hawkins is trying to take the scientific model of describing how things work and kind of expanding it beyond the mere, cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, to something that explains the origin of Big Bang cosmology, but in a way that seems very similar to the actual theory itself. A quantum fluctuation, spontaneous and short-lived appearance of subatomic particles from a vacuum. And by the way, those we have empirical evidence for the existence of such quantum fluctuations or spontaneous but short-lived appearances of atomic particles. We can see those, in the laboratory. Of course, tiny, very, very short-lived ones. And Hawkins takes that observation and kind of tries to apply it to the universe itself. But here's a crucial observation that Peterson puts forth. This quantum space and quantum fluctuations that are proposed or posited by Hawkins they're not nothing, right? It's not a beginning from nothing. It's a beginning from something. So what Hawking is actually doing is that he's saying that the Big Bang cosmology is not the beginning of the physical universe as such, but it's the beginning of something, a kind of large part of physical universe, matter, antimatter, and so on. But there are some physical things that were there prior to that singularity, namely quantum space and the possibility of quantum fluctuations. And those things are kind of eternal, or at least prior to the singularity. And those physical things that are purely natural processes gave rise to the singularity, which is the thing that is with part of the Big Bang cosmology. So there is no creation from nothing in Hawking's account. And Peterson points that out. He says, well, that merely pushes the question farther. So Peterson continues, quote, actually, Hawking merely pushes the questions of the origins one step farther. Why is there quantum gravity and all the relevant laws of physics that are operating within Hawking's model prior to the singularity? From within science, there is no answer to this question. Why are we are now in the territory of metaphysics, where theism and naturalism are major competitors. So something valuable that Peterson is doing is that he's making an important distinction between proper scientific theorizing as such, and then taking being a theorist about the kind of results of science. The proper theorizing of science as such is the Big Bang cosmology in this case, and then thinking about that and trying to provide additional explanations. That's something that should be labeled something like metaphysical thinking or philosophical thinking. And it's not science proper. It does not operate within the normal kind of constraints of scientific inquiry. And that's the kind of thing that Hawkins is doing. It's just Hawkins is a lot closer to, it smells like, it seems like a lot what physicists are doing. He himself is, of course, a great physicist. But it's crucial to read it that way. It's crucial to see that that's what's happening, Peterson points out. So let's actually look at an argument that Peterson puts forth from the Big Bang cosmology observation, right? So there's observation of the universe at a beginning, results from the Big Bang cosmology. And Peterson puts forth an argument. He's not the one that originated this argument, but he puts it forth. And it's historically been called a Kalam cosmological argument, so let's use that label as well. And here's what the argument says. Premise number one. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. This is a basic principle of reality. You can think of it as a scientific principle. That's not quite the right way of thinking about it, because it's not kind of a result of an experiment. It seems more like a scientific presupposition, or people have called this an ontology principle or a philosophical principle, a principle of the intelligibility of the world. It's difficult to, it's hard to try to articulate exactly how to label this thing, but we kind of think through it. Science kind of presupposes some of it, though it doesn't result from it. But it's a very intuitive principle. It seems that it must be true. Crucially, it does not say everything has a beginning. It says everything that begins to exist has a cause. So it does not say everything has a beginning or everything has a cause. That's too simplistic of a principle. It's a better one. It's a more nuanced one. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. So numbers, if they're eternal, they don't need to have a cause, or at least this principle does not require that they have a cause because they never began to exist. Premise number two, the universe itself, the physical universe, began to exist. And the support for premise number two is just Big Bang cosmology, right? That's one of the great discoveries of the 20th century, that the universe began to exist. So we have very good evidence for this. But that's all we need, right? Says Peterson. Here's the thing that follows from these two observations. The universe has a cause for its existence. And this follows, right? If you see 1 and 2, one is this kind of principle, this rule that says, if you find something and that something has a beginning, here's what you're entitled to conclude about that something, that something has a cause. Something else brought the thing into existence. Premise 2 says, oh, here's something that has a beginning, the universe. So we're entitled to conclude logically from 1 and 2, we're entitled to conclude 3. The universe has a cause for its existence. So what do we make of this argument? How do we respond to this argument? Here's what Peterson thinks. Here are the different responses. And as far as I can tell, they're like logically exhaustive responses, all of the possible ways for responding to this argument, all of it. If you can think of one that I did not think of, let me know. But here are, I think, all of the possible ways of responding to the argument. Response number one, this is Peterson's response. To say, yeah, that's a good argument, it's a sound argument. Premises are true, the conclusion follows. And furthermore, the best kind of candidate for the cause in question is God. God is the cause of the universe. So Big Bang cosmology, conjoined with principle articulated in premise number one, gives us that it is reasonable to think that God exists. God is the most likely cause for the origin of the universe. That's what Peterson thinks. That's the reasonable thing to conclude. Is this science? Well, no, but like that we're doing philosophy, we're not doing science, right? If you endorse scientism, you might think, oh, anything that's not science should be rejected. But we've looked at that, right? Peterson thinks there is no reason for thinking. Science is great, but doesn't mean that anything outside of science is not credible, not believable, not true. But anyway, so Peterson's response to the Kalam cosmological argument is to think that it's sound and to think that the best candidate for the cause is God. So Big Bang cosmology is a good reason for thinking that God exists. Here's a different response that we already articulated, and this is Hawkins' response. And Hawkins actually accepts this argument. He accepts that everything has a beginning, has a cause, and the universe had a beginning, Big Bang cosmology, and therefore that the universe has a cause. Just that Hawkins does not think that the best candidate for the cause is God. Hawkins, at least later in his life, earlier on he thought differently, but later in his life he thought that the best candidate is kind of the universe itself or a part of the universe, right? So sometimes he uses the universe cause itself, but really he means something like physical facts like quantum gravity, quantum space, possibility of quantum fluctuations with imaginary time, you put the mathematical model, those things kind of can give rise to, and he thinks most likely to believe, it is more reasonable to believe that they did give rise to the physical universe as we know it. But Hawkins then accepts this argument, but thinks that the best candidate for the cause is not God, but a part of the universe itself. Here's the third. Now let's just kind of fill logical space. Look at all of the possible responses to this argument to get a sense of which one's better and more credible. Response number three is to deny premise one, to think that some things that came into existence had to come into existence by being caused, right? Some things violate principle articulated in premise one. Some things just come into existence, just pop into existence for no reason, no cause, just chaotically, like unintelligibly. The universe need not be intelligible. Sometimes some things just happen. And furthermore, the universe is one of those things. Not everything that comes into existence has a cause. Some things do, some things do not. The universe came into existence, but on cause. It just popped into existence out of nowhere for no reason. Is that a satisfying response? Probably not, but it's a response. And some people have said these things, right? So it is one of the logical alternatives. Respond number four to this argument, denying premise one, but in a different way. Here's what the proponent of this reply would say. The question, what caused the Big Bang or what is prior to the singularity that we've been discussing, is not a meaningful question because it is not empirically verifiable. And meaning of language is tied to verifiability. You say things that are meaningful only to the extent that there are some conditions for verification attached to your sentences. And if there are no conditions for verification, empirical verification connected to your sentences, then your sentences are rubberish. They don't mean anything. They're just sounds. They just have a kind of quasi grammatical structure that makes you think they mean something, but they don't, right? So this way of putting things denies that any of those principles that are not empirically verifiable themselves, but conditions for science, are meaningful. So contrary to appearances, the question what caused the Big Bang doesn't mean anything, doesn't make any sense. Some people have said these things. So that's another response you may have to the Kalam. Here's another response, a fifth response. Denying premise number 2, denying Big Bang cosmology, claiming that contrary to the evidence that we have, the theory is mistaken. Some people have taken that route. I'm just going to put it there as a possibility, denying the science. And finally, Roos. Roos is actually none of these. He's a proponent of skepticism. He thinks that we do not know why the universe exists or whether it was caused. We just don't know. We cannot know 3 because we cannot know 1, though we do know 2, right? That's Big Bang cosmology. So 1 is unknowable, therefore 3 is unknowable. The conclusion is unknowable. As far as I can tell, these are all of the options, all of the ways of interacting or responding to the Kalam cosmological argument. Peterson thinks that it is clear that God is the best response. He's the best alternative. He would question, for example, Roos' skepticism. How does Roos know that we don't know? Like, what are the reasons for thinking that we don't know? It is convenient for an atheist to say we don't know in this context, but like, why should we think that we don't know? The proponent of Big Bang cosmology, I'm sorry, the one who rejects Big Bang cosmology, denying premise 2, Peterson will also say, well, you're just denying the science. That's not a very good, not very proposing, a very promising reply or way of going about. The fourth reply, denying premise number 3 for thinking that is meaningless. Advances in contemporary linguistics seem to show that the claim that meaningful sentences are those that are empirically verifiable is a shaky one, and there's been a lot of objections to that kind of way of thinking. It was popular at one point in the early 20th century to say these things, but now the vast majority of people that work in philosophy of language linguistics thinks that this is not quite correct. Reply 3 seems hard to wrap your head around. It seems not as satisfying or as explanatorily worthwhile as Peterson's own proposal of God. So as far as Peterson is concerned, Hawkins and his reply are the better ones, and but he still thinks that God is the best, most satisfying explanation, and then after that is Hawkins. Okay, I'll end here. I'll see you next time.